Greetings friends, I am Vitaly Portnikov. The British publication The Telegraph emphasizes that the Russian summer offensive on Ukrainian territories has effectively stalled without any significant results. And it can be said that one of the main reasons the occupiers are unable to achieve their goals is the overstretching of the front and their resources. The Russians are trying to advance in several directions at once. They are advancing in the Donetsk direction in order to fulfill Putin's demand, which was announced back in February 2022, namely to reach the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And now it is clear that the Russian army has been given a new task, not just to reach the borders with the Dnipropetrovsk region, but also to try to capture settlements within the Dnipropetrovsk itself in order to begin creating so-called buffer zones, which Putin described as the first stage of a new annexation of Ukrainian regions. The second Russian offensive is in the direction of Sumy. The Russians are not hiding this either. This is also explained by their desire to create a buffer zone on the border with Ukraine after the operation by the Ukrainian defense forces in the territory of Russia's Kursk region. And although Putin emphasized that capturing the regional center of Sumy is not part of the occupiers' plans, he did not rule out such a possibility, and yet another offensive in the Kupiansk direction. This can also be explained by the desire to create a so-called buffer zone, but it is worth recalling that in 2022, Kupiansk had already been declared by the occupiers as the temporary regional center of Kharkiv region. It is obvious that preparations were underway for a so-called referendum on the creation of an independent state called Kharkiv region, with the subsequent annexation of this pseudo-state to the Russian Federation. And no one has said that Putin has abandoned these political plans today, because the salami tactic of seizing more and more Ukrainian regions remains the main course of action for the Russian president after the Russians failed in their blitzkrieg of 2022. However, just like in the 2022 blitzkrieg, the overstretched front is playing a cruel joke on the occupiers, and they simply do not have the ability to properly allocate all their resources in order to achieve success in even a single specific direction. And success in one specific direction can lead to defeat in other areas where the Russians are trying to continue their offensive actions. Military analysts were already saying, even before it began, that the Russian army's summer offensive was unlikely to end with any significant result. And precisely because they saw that Russia was preparing to launch an offensive in several directions at once. And in such a situation, given the limited resources of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, it is impossible to achieve results. Yes, it is obvious that the military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation has been developing quite intensively since 2022, and Russia has increased its amount of weaponry. But at the same time, there are clear problems with mobilizing new soldiers to ensure the sustainability of the army. This is due to the fact that Putin has decided to pursue the path of creating a huge army of mercenaries. Anyone who is willing to take part in the war against Ukraine receives substantial money from the Russian state. But there are not that many marginalized citizens who are willing to kill for money and for whom participation in the crimes of the Russian armed forces is the only means of social mobility. And the amount of money needed to attract more and more new mercenaries to the army keeps increasing all the time. And the budget, as we can see, does not appear to be elastic under the new economic and energy conditions. And so Vladimir Putin himself is already starting to talk about the possibility of reducing the military budget in the coming years, simply because the Russian economy is objectively beginning to overheat. So how in such a situation can you quickly mobilize new lumpen, train them to fight in a short time, and still expect results from them on several sections of the front at once? Realizing that the summer offensive is unlikely to lead to any significant territorial gains, the president of the Russian Federation is increasing terror against the civilian population. There are several objectives here at once. First, the destruction of Ukraine's military infrastructure in order to reduce the ability of the Ukrainian defense forces to stop the Russian offensive in the Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions of our country. And of course, terror against the civilian population. To make Ukrainians believe that they have no other choice but to surrender and accept the demands of the Russian Federation. Here too, the plan is absolutely clear: to force Ukrainians, under a barrage of shelling, to admit that they have no choice but to accept Russia's idea of withdrawing Ukrainian troops from the territories that have been declared Russian according to the Russian constitution. We are talking about the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions to consolidate their positions along new front lines. To make decisions regarding the creation of buffer zones on the borders of the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian regions it has occupied bordering Ukraine. And already from these new positions, after the Russian army, Russia's military-industrial complex and the army's personnel have been renewed to launch a new offensive with the aim of seizing new Ukrainian regions according to the same scenario. Part of the region is occupied, a referendum is held on joining the Russian Federation, and under a new wave of shelling, Ukrainians are forced to withdraw their troops from these regions as well. And so, over the course of several years, most of Ukraine's territory becomes part of the Russian Federation, while a puppet state is created on the remaining part completely under Moscow's control. In other words, this is about carrying out the same blitzkrieg plan from 2022, only stretched out over the 2020s and possibly even into part of the 2030s of the 21st century. And of course, terror against the Ukrainian civilian population remains an integral part of this criminal plan of Putin's, especially given that his army cannot advance across Ukrainian territory in the way that its so-called supreme commander in the Kremlin would like. And that is why it is necessary to understand the logic behind this terror and the logic of its consequences, as well as the connection between the almost daily attacks on Ukrainian cities and the problems that have arisen for the armed forces of the Russian Federation during yet another offensive against Ukrainian positions, which is not yielding the results expected by the Russian political and military leadership. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social media, and on my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello channels, which help support and develop these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.